Good afternoon. My name is Suzanne Scott, and I am the Texas State Director for the Nature Conservancy. And I am glad to see all of you here this afternoon. I am just going to do a quick introduction here, and then we're going to get right to our speakers. The theme of this conference is highlighting the changing landscapes of Texas, and nowhere is that more evident than on our waterways and coast. Increased population growth and development, coupled with the impacts of climate change, threaten the biodiversity and sustainability of these vital natural resources. We have historically experienced severe droughts and floods and hurricanes in Texas. But now we are seeing these storms with more frequency and more intensity than ever before. We are really in the midst of two simultaneous environmental crises, a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. Both are interrelated and present this sense of urgency that all of us feel that we need heightened attention and heightened action. In Texas, these impacts of these two environmental crises are accelerated by the incredible amount of growth that we are seeing in the state. This is bringing even more competition for very limited natural resources to support people and nature. At the Nature Conservancy, we are working to protect and restore land and water habitats and adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Over the past 60 years, we have protected almost 1 million acres of land in Texas and more than 200 miles of streams. These lands and waters are now some of the most iconic places that many of you have already visited, including Enchanted Rock, Mustang Island, Big Bend National Park, the Guadalupe Mountains National Park, Davis Mountains, Caddo Lake, Honey Creek Natural Area, and many, many other places. TNC has protected lands and waters in all of our landscapes throughout the state. But closer to San Antonio, we have been very honored to be part of the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program. And we have, through the Nature Conservancy, protected nearly 90,000 acres of the 166,000 acres that have been protected over the Edwards Aquifer from future development. So that is a real achievement here in the Bexar County area. But protection of these lands could not have occurred without the willingness and strong conservation ethic of individual landowners who for generations have loved the lands of our great state and desire to protect them. And that is one of the things that we're celebrating here at the Witte, is this heritage of land ownership and how critical it is to protecting these natural resources that we love so much. But conservation takes a village of many passionate advocates working to protect and restore the changing landscapes of Texas. In today's presentations from Dr. Larry McKinney of the Harte Research Institute and Romey Swanson of Audubon, Texas, you will learn how the impacts of biodiversity and climate crisis are showing up in our coastal ecosystems and in the health and well-being of bird species, and how rapid population growth is compounding the challenges on these ecosystems. So we're going to start first with Dr. Larry McKinney. You see his bio in the book, so I won't necessarily read through. He is a leading scientist in Texas, and through his work at the Harte Institute, the Harte Research Institute has become one of the most impactful and well-known research institutions here in the Gulf of Mexico. And then he will be followed by Romey Swanson, who is the Director of Conservation Strategies for Audubon, Texas. We all have heard him speak many, many times. He's very, very knowledgeable. He has worked in the state, national, and international partners to identify and advance important conservation strategies for the benefit of birds, landscapes, and the communities that depend on them. So let's first start with Larry, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Maybe. Oh, okay. I'm trying, but this is not working. Okay. So from a family perspective, I want to talk a little bit about how we have perceived Texas over time, and that Texas perception really did start with the European immigration into Texas. And yes, we are all migrants here in Texas. We migrated to Texas from the European side of things, and my family came in 1924, one of the old 300, at least that part of the McKinney side. And there's been McKinneys in the state. Sorry to tell you that, but we've been all over the state. My side of the family is from Thomas Freeman McKinney, but then Colin McKinney, who was one of the signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence. So they've been around, and we have probably contributed to the myth of what Texas is to some extent. So I'll talk about it a little bit. Maybe I have too. I know one time when I was in Cuba and we were having an event there at the University of Havana, this was a few years ago, and the rector of the university came up to me and said, Dr. McKinney, are all Texans as big as you? And I said, yes, I'm basically average in every way. So, but we had a good laugh. It probably contributed to it. But that's part of the concern of what I'm talking about, and that we have contributed to all these myths of how we think about Texas. And that has, in reality of it, no, joking aside, there is always a grain of truth to all these types of things. And we in Texas, from the very beginning, because Texas was so large and we had such abundant resources that we always felt that we couldn't use them up. And so we've always thought that there's always more land to be plowed, that there's more land to be grazed, that there's more deer to shoot. You just simply moved on. And that's what my family did. We moved west. When we felt there was too many people in Texas, we just moved out and settled into the west of Texas, and went about our business of being Texans out there. That was until 1950, 1957, which was the drought of record for the state of Texas. Now, there's been another drought period worse than that, but there's never been a period of time, other than establishment of Texas, that there's been more change as a result of a natural phenomenon. It changed the people and it changed the land forever. And that's really what I want to talk about. It certainly had an effect on me and my family. I was born at the beginning of the drought and my sister in the middle of it. And so I lived through that period of time. And I talk about it a lot because it really had an impact on me throughout. Whenever I give talks, nearly always. Texas Monthly did their story on the last drop of water on the drought in Texas, and one of the reporters got in touch with me to ask me about what I knew about it. And I had a lot of stories that I told them about it, but the one that stuck with them and they did look like that. If y'all never seen one, they do look like that. That's not unusual. But at the end of the school day, we had to form up in the rooms, all hold hands on the bus, and a teacher would take us to the bus because we couldn't see the buses from 100 yards away. And they were afraid as first graders we would be lost and blown away. So that's how we got on school buses, how difficult that was. If you really want to know about that period of time, if you are interested in that history, this book, The Time It Never Rained by Elmer Kelton, is a powerful one. I read it once. I've never been able to pick it up again because my family lived that out there. So it's a powerful, powerful book about that. So that sets the stage a little bit. What I really want to talk about is the fact that it had a tremendous impact on the coast of Texas. So I'm going to use this little graphic, and I'm going to use this for a bit, so I want to explain it. Up on the left-hand side, I picked out the number of lakes and reservoirs of 50,000 acre-feet or more that were built in Texas over a period of time. The population of Texas appears over there on the right, and the distribution of that population, be it rural and urban, and how that split out over those periods of time, and some little notes in the beginning. For example, Texas clearly was a rural state before 1913. We had no lakes over 50,000 acre-feet. We had very few lakes in the state of Texas. The map is very deceiving. It looks like there's water everywhere in Texas. That shouldn't be blue. It should probably be brown for the most part. There's a lot of places where water could be, and there's a lot of places where water isn't. But that's the state of Texas. So let's run through that quickly and kind of show you the basis of what I'm talking about. Between 1913 and 1949, we did understand the Dust Bowl that took place mostly to the north of us, Oklahoma, in that place, some places in Texas, but we knew about it. And so we did build some reservoirs in that period of time. And I picked 1949 because that was the year I was born. And so that's significant to me, nobody else. Population of Texas has almost doubled in that period of time, though. We're still very solidly a rural state, 68% out in the country, 32% in the city. Alice, of the cities in the state of Texas and plus anywhere, really understood water. They figured out how important water was, but most importantly, they figured out what the power of having water comes with. And today, and starting right then, Dallas and Fort Worth, they control that entire part of the state. Nothing happens there that they don't have a say in because they control all the water there. They figured that out a long time ago. Between 1950 and 1959, of course, that's the drought of record. Huge impact. Our population did increase, but basically everyone in rural Texas ran to the cities because there was nothing left out there. The drought took farms out, ranches out, and there was nothing left to do. The entire population in the rural part of Texas moved as fast as they could to the city. We built as many reservoirs in that period of time as in all the other time before that. We began to figure out that we may not be limited in Texas in a lot of things, but we are limited in water. That hit us right between the eyes. We figured it out, and we started figuring out we'd better figure out how to set some water aside so that didn't happen again. Get there? Maybe. Out there, right? So from 60 to 69, we're still moving out of our population is growing, and we're still moving out of the country more and more. In fact, by now, we're more urban than we're rural. And this was the golden age of big reservoirs. We were building big reservoirs, far beyond 50,000 acre feet, far larger than that, all across the state of Texas. Any place where a couple of rivers came together and had water flowing in them, we were building reservoirs at those points. Between 70 and 79, we're thoroughly an urban state. Now, in that period of time, we're still building big reservoirs, and take a look at what Dallas and Fort Worth, I mean, they've got it all covered there. But there were fewer and fewer places that you could actually build a big reservoir that would catch enough water because we had just used up all the good places, the places that could generate big reservoirs. By 80 to 89, again, thoroughly urbanized. Our population is growing very quickly. And this is the time that I refer to. This is when I was at Parks and Wildlife, and a big part of my duty was fighting reservoirs being built in places that could not sustain them. I don't know if you ever read the book called Cadillac Desert, but it's about water development in the West. If you're interested in water development, you should read it. And what happened in Texas was something very similar. We had groups of lawyers and engineers come together to go to all across the state of Texas like aluminum siding salesmen, and my apologies to the aluminum siding salesmen, going across the state, convincing taxing districts that they should build a reservoir, knowing full well that the place couldn't hold it, but the taxing district go out and sell some bonds, millions of dollars of bonds, build a reservoir. They got their money, and they left, and then the local group was left there stuck with a reservoir that had no water in it, but bonds that had to be paid. Happened all across the state of Texas. We fought them hard over that time. I remember we had a great party when we became aces of stopping dams. It was Little Cypress Reservoir. We killed Little Cypress Reservoir. That was the 5th reservoir that we stopped because it should not have been built. And it was a place where actually the citizens of the area voted twice not to pay the bonds on it. We finally began to figure out that there was no water in the state of Texas for doing something like that. But it took a while to get there. And by now, by 20, there's a few more reservoirs being built. We are solidly an urban state. 85% of our population is in the state. There's really no places left to build reservoirs. We still talk about building reservoirs today, but I'm telling you, there are none really places you can build a reservoir of 50,000 acre feet or more that would actually be sustained. And as we used to do surveys in the cities, Texas cities, to get attitudes toward all kinds of things, one of our surveyor groups came to us and said, we just did our surveys in Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston and all these Texas cities that we did our Parks and Wildlife surveys. Said, if you put those surveys up against all the cities in the northeast of the U.S., we couldn't tell you apart. Texas has all but disappeared from being Texas. We are not any different than anybody else. Sorry to say that, but that's what the facts show. We can have a discussion about that later, but that's the reality of it. I must be able to stand right. Now, I didn't even talk about all the soil conservation reservoirs, all these small reservoirs that if you live on a farm or a ranch where you can build a 2 or 3 acre pond, do that without getting any permit, some permits, but not much. But there are thousands of those. That really took what was left of the water that the big dams didn't take. So what was the impact of all this? You have to be in just the right place, I guess. So what are we talking about? Why are we so concerned about all these dams being built? It's because of the water that they divert from the coast. And our coast needs water because all of our bays and estuaries depend on them. Here's an example. When Choke Canyon Dam was closed in 1982, the freshwater inflows to the coast were reduced by 55%. By the early 1990s, all the oysteries in Corpus Christi Bay and Nueces Bay were basically gone, nothing but a pile of rocks. That was the final straw for them because you cut that water off. So why are we worried about water? Is the lifeblood of the Texas coast. We have one of the most amazing coastal systems anywhere in the world. Lots of water coming into the northeastern section. Down at the bottom, we have the lagoonal system, one of the hypersaline lagoons, and everything in between. That water comes in, and not only it creates salinity gradients where every one of our important estuarine species depends on different salinities within that bay at different times. Oysters, crabs, shrimp, redfish, all those tarpon have that. They need all that. So if we don't have fresh water coming in, it just becomes a big bay and salty. But it also is not the only thing we need. Dams don't just stop water. They stop nutrients and they stop sediments. We don't have those. How am I doing? I haven't been looking at you. I need to. We're good. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep my time. They stopped nutrients, all of those inland water, all that inland, those rivers and things we looked at on those maps. They collect all the sediments and a lot of nutrients and plant material from those rivers and deliver them to the bays. That's the basis of the food chain. Also, that sediment comes in because our bay bottoms are continually settling down, compacting. So we need new sediment coming in so these plants can live because they have depth ranges as well. So if we don't have all that coming in, the coast is not what the coast should be. And so basically what I'm getting to with all this little discussion is what have we done to our Texas coast because of all the dams that we built in the state of Texas? And it's really simple, that over those period of time that we've been building all of those dams, we have been steadily shrinking the coast of Texas. Basically, our coastal and estuarine systems are about half of what they used to be. And we look back in the old books and stories, and I've collected a lot of those books and helped people write them up to talk about what it was like fishing back in the 50s and the 60s and those types of things. And so the anecdotal stories match up with the actual science that basically we reduced our coast in half in order to supply the water we need for the populations that we have. That's just the trade-off that we made. And so that has certainly been a difficult issue to work with. And looking at how we manage all those resources, what has really happened as a result of all of this is what has come in on top of this, and it has basically been the thing that has compacted it all that we haven't thought about having to deal with back in the 50s, and that has been climate change, and that's the issue that we're dealing with now. Climate change is an issue that I dealt with a lot. Just to make this point, as I always tell people, because there's big opinions on them, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, not their own facts. And there's 3 facts that I've been measuring for years. And it's these 3 things that we got to deal with. Come on. That the oceans are warming, the sea levels are rising, and they're becoming more and more acidic. And so what does that mean for our coast that we're dealing with now? Trying to get there. Is, for example, when we look at our coastlines, our summers, water temperatures, they have increased, but they're not increasing dramatically. What really has increased is our winter temperatures. We're getting to the point where we no longer have winters on our Texas coast, which means for some things it's good, like snook and other tropical fish, they're moving north. But fish like flounder, they're disappearing. Invasive species coming in. Most of them are not good. So those are issues we've got to deal with. We also been measuring our coast for the last 100 years. Our coast has been sinking relative sea level rise. Not only has the sea been rising, but we've been taking oil and gas and water out of our coastal areas, and so they've been compacting and sinking. Up in Galveston, our sea level has down on the south coast over 15 inches. So that has had all kinds of impacts. For example, hurricanes that we talked about. Our hurricanes are becoming more often and more intense because of all these issues and greater impacts that we've got to deal with. So there's a lot of things happening on the coast. I used to get accused of these talks, and it's some outdoor writers used to call me, well, here comes Dr. Doom with his talks again every year. So I decided I need to change that a little bit. I'm going to wrap up on this thing to talk about the fact that we can do something about it. I put a report card together a few years ago about looking at issues of habitat and fisheries and birds and all these types of things. And actually, our report card came out pretty well. Our entire Texas coast had a B-. That's not bad with all the issues that we've been dealing with. It's still that healthy, so it's something to live and work with. There are issues. Romey's going to talk about birds, so I'll leave that alone. Habitat is our biggest issue, working on oyster reefs and those things. So those are issues that we got to do something about. But the Texas coast is very resilient. If we just give it a chance, it'll spring back. And so we have the opportunity to do it, and people are doing it. We're working together with many partners, Nature Conservancy and Audubon, for example, in that we're about to invest $20 million to bring oysters back on the Texas coast. A private foundation has stepped up to do that. And we're going to be able to help improve the entire Texas coast because of that. Our scientists at HRI know what the future looks like on our Texas coast. We know how to work with the cities, and we're working with cities now in the state and the military and local folks about how do we protect our coastline? Are there places that we need to armor it, places that we need to leave it alone? What we need to do to make sure we can deal with sea level rise that's continuing. And we now have a coastal resiliency plan that's going forward we've never had before to help us deal with all these things. Those things are happening. We have some of the best water scientists in the world. Even though our coasts, our bays and estuaries have shrunk in half, we now know how to deal with that. The water we have left, we know how best to use that to make sure that we continue productivity. So we're aiming and still doing that type of thing. Even with a disaster like Deepwater Horizon, we're now working with over $18 billion in restoration efforts to try to restore from that. And we're making, our goal is to actually make sure that the money we have left, we do big projects and big meaningful projects. So that's moving forward as well. So I'll leave you with this thought that what we all need to understand is the Texas coast is a place of contrast. It's a place where the environment and the economy, they do contend with one another, but they also can coexist if we're all working together toward that end. And it's a place of incomparable beauty. If you see the coast and been there, so many places we'll get there. It's worthy of all of our best efforts to try to save it, not only for now, but for those that those that come afterwards. And it's all within our power to do. We have the understanding, we have the knowledge to do it. We just have to make sure we make the decision to do so. And that's what all of us here about today, is to try to help move that forward. So thank you for taking the time, and I know we're working on it. So Romey, get up and tell them what we need to do.
I'm going to stand at the podium if it's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Hello? 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 Is that better? Okay, great. Thank you. I'm not sure how to advance these slides. I'm hitting the button. I'm supposed to point at the screen. Did somebody bring the PowerPoint up, or? Okay. There we go. They're pulling the slides up. I'll just say to begin that it's been a real I've had a privileged career so far for the last 15 years. I've gotten to see and work on some of the most amazing and beautiful, inspiring landscapes within Texas, both on public and private lands. And for an abundance of reasons, I think that we should all be proud to be Texans and in the natural resources we have, the biodiversity that Texas supports. But I think that there's an abundance of reasons to be concerned, particularly as we try to continue to steward and manage those natural resources. So my presentation today will be kind of a potpourri of why we should celebrate Texas. Some of the conservation concerns that those wonderful species that we've out there face, and we'll get kicked off as soon as I get some slides up here. All right, great, thank you. Larry, how did you hold your mouth open when you did that? Okay, so why is Texas so special? Well, I'm going to share with you that I'm a bit of a cartophile, I'm a bibliophile, and I'm a biophile, which means that I love maps, books, and wildlife in general. So I tell a lot of stories through images. One of the things about Texas and why it's so great is so big. It's just so big, and so this map illustrates here. Maybe we advanced one on accident here. This map illustrates about how big Texas is. So what's shaded in there around the United States is the equivalent distance across Texas, which is about a little over 800 miles. So if you drove 800 miles from any boundary of Texas, you could reach almost the entire United States. You could get down to almost to Central America, and deep into southern Mexico. And I love this road sign here. So when I use the pointer, it advances the slide. So I'm going to stop that. But if you saw, it said Beaumont 23 miles, and then El Paso's 823. And in the next picture below it says tomorrow, because you're not getting there today if you're driving. That's just how big Texas is. Texas has influences from major ecological landscapes from across the continent, and they all sort of converge here. You have elements of the southeastern United States forests, the Great Plains, the desert regions of West Texas, and some of the temperate Sierras reaching in from the Guadalupe Peaks. This supports an abundance of ecosystems. We have 10 to 12, depending on which map you're looking at and who made it. This one has all 12 of our major ecoregions that are identified by Texas Parks and Wildlife. Each ecoregion supports a unique blend of wildlife and vegetation. We have an amazing elevational gradient across Texas. We have 370 some odd miles of coastline at 0 feet in elevation, all the way up to 8,751 feet at Guadalupe Peak in the Guadalupe Mountains range. For instance, the central county, the Vegas region is Jeff Davis County. It has the Davis Mountains within it. The footprint of the Davis Mountains above 1 mile in elevation is over 800 square miles. So it's truly a huge footprint and area that supports an amazing and unique assemblage of wildlife. And there's a few sky islands out there amongst this desert sea. We also see a wide and varying precipitational gradient here, where we have over 60 inches that can fall on the southeastern portion of the state near Beaumont, to less than 12 inches over towards El Paso. So a huge gradient across the United States, or across Texas. And you can also see in those sky islands of the far west Texas, these rain shadows, where you have those elevational gradients that create their own weather and more rainfall, which can also drive really unique habitats and landscapes. An amazing amount of water. As Larry had mentioned earlier, we have some of the most iconic rivers within the nation. Even the Rio Grande is the longest Texas river. It's the 4th longest river of the United States. We have the Brazos River, which is our most dammed river in Texas, and of course the Devil's River, which provides some of the cleanest and purest river within the state. What we have here in the Edwards Plateau, or Central Texas portion of the state, are 14 significantly named rivers that emerge from the ground as spring flow. Right here in the Edwards Plateau, 14 rivers that provide very pure, clean water when they start, and then they head towards the Gulf to nourish it. And those are all supported by an underlying array of aquifer systems, which are recharged by rainfall and in some cases are old water that have fallen a long time ago that have sat underground for an equally long period of time. So it's not just maps, but we can see these stories of convergence within Texas through the lens of birds. For instance, this bird here is a yellow-throated warbler. This is a species that is deeply associated, as the map at the top right shows, with East Texas. It's associated with forested bottomlands. And we get a little bit of that right here in Central Texas. So they breed on our Texas rivers, which look a lot like eastern rivers. However, in this picture, you'll see that it's posted up on a shrub. It's called leather stem, and that's associated with arid climates. And in particular, you find a species of shrub, a low-growing shrub, in the Chihuahuan Desert. So those two things don't quite go together. This bird was territorial. It was singing. It was actively nesting and breeding when I found it. And this is when I found this, took this picture quite a few years ago. I was on Dolan Falls Preserve on the Devil's River, which is on the far western part of the Edwards Plateau, where the last vestiges of eastern rivers show up. It's just a thread, a ribbon of riparian habitat and gallery woodland cutting through the desert. So a beautiful example there. Another one for me, looking at birds without pivoting, without moving my body, only pivoting my foot. While bird watching, I saw this barred owl. And you can see here in this map that's to the left of the barred owl, I've got San Antonio starred there, so that you can see that barred owls in general are very eastern distributed species, particularly in Texas, also within the United States. But at the same time as looking at the barred owl, I was also looking at not this varied bunting, but a varied bunting, which it is a very western distributed species. And then I look up to see this Morelet seed eater singing also at the same time. And you can see, according to the map here, the star San Antonio. South of that, this is a very southern distributed species. At one point in space, I saw all three of these animals on territories on breeding territories at the same place, same time. And this happened in Del Rio, Texas, along San Felipe Creek. So it's an experience that it's not just maps, but you can see it by having lived experiences out and observing nature. Texas supports a dizzying array of bird diversity. This map is a heat map of where that bird diversity occurs across the United States. And you can see the Texas coast just lights up because we're a landing pad for migratory species in particular, but we have an abundance of breeding, overwintering, and resident species right here in the state. Overall, Texas supports a crazy amount of species richness. We have the number 2 state in all of the United States as far as total species, wildlife and plants. We have the 3rd highest rate of endemism, which means that species occurs nowhere else in the world except within Texas. We're only behind Hawaii, where everything is endemic because it evolved there, and in California. California is another very unique and diverse state. We're number 1 in birds overall that use Texas as part of their natural life cycles. There are lots of lists that include vagrancies, where a species showed up once, and now it's on the state list. California beats us on the total, but for those species that use the state as a part of their natural life cycle, Texas is number 1. And we're number 2 in mammals and plants. So there's a lot to celebrate through the lens of wildlife. And this, people like me that get excited about, people like Larry that like to go out and look at wildlife. We support an incredible economy in the state of Texas. We have about 2.2 million bird watchers self-identified within the state, which supports together with other nature watchers, supports a $1.8 billion ecotourism driven economy within the state. And these numbers are a little bit old at this point. Those numbers have probably gone up through the COVID period, where folks were seeking nature contact and wildlife viewing as a pastime. But we also have an abundance of conservation challenges. Texas is a changing landscape, and we have incredible growth occurring within our boundaries. This map illustrates some of the highest rates of land use conversion. Where the darker green areas are, we're seeing more land taking out of natural landscapes, working lands, farms and ranches, and converted to development or other uses. It's alarming because of the total amount of acres that we have in the state. Over a 20-year period ending in 2017, we saw 2.2 million acres lost. Even more alarming was that 1.2 million of those acres occurred in the last 10 years of that 20-year period. This is Karankawa Bay. This is the mouth of Karankawa Bay. This is a sub bay of Matagorda Bay. This is where Audubon's doing some work. And I want to call your attention to these 2 yellow areas, the arrows. They're not going to move in relation to where they're pointing. This is a map of 1990. The point to the right is Shickey Point, and the arrow to the left is a little breach in Redfish Lake. This is what's occurred over that 28-year period. Significant erosion associated with sea level rise, driving tides, and other stressors. Texas supports currently 12 federally listed threatened and endangered bird species. 7 are endangered, 5 threatened, and a couple of candidate species. We also have a conservation action plan written by Parks and Wildlife, informed by organizations like TNC, Audubon, Harte Research Institute, to identify those assemblage of species of greatest conservation need. We have 1,300 species identified. These are not endangered species necessarily or threatened, but they're species that are downtrending, and that if we can identify now, draw interventions to them while it's cheap, we can maybe be more effective and with our few resources to intervene on behalf of those species. We have 110 birds listed in that document. Now, if you remember, I said there's about 500 species of birds that use Texas as part of their natural life cycles. Over 20% of them are identified at some level of imperil. You would have had to had your head in the sand, perhaps, in 2019 if you missed this report that came out that alerted us that the 3 billion birds report, which suggests that 3 billion birds have been lost over the last 50 years, 3 billion individual birds less in the population of the United States. That's 1 in 4 compared to 1970 times. Now, those declines don't hit all species the same. Some assemblages are hit harder, and some have actually recovered fairly well. Our biggest concern, perhaps, is, or those that assemblage has been hit the hardest, are those species that are obligate to grasslands, rangelands and grasslands, like the meadowlark in that photograph. We've also seen some declines in migratory species and eastern forest species and a bunch of others. But we've also had some successes here. And instead of being the new Dr. Doom, I'll tell you about some success stories. We've had incredible recovery of waterfowl over that period of time, largely driven by sportsmen, sportswomen, and their excise taxes going into Pittman-Robertson funds, wetland restoration, and duck stamps. We, in the 1960s and 70s, were awakened by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and addressed some of the chemical use, the pesticide use, which has largely allowed for us to be innovative and fix some of those issues so that our raptors are recovering, brown pelicans too, and then woodpeckers have also had a great rebound. We've seen an analysis from 2015 which identifies an abundance of direct mortality causes for birds. You'll see the top left cardinal was hit by a car. You have a window strike here with the sparrow in the middle. Feral cats or outdoor cats are a significant problem. We have had transmission line collisions, and we've had some losses from windmills and wind turbines, and then electrocution from power lines. Those are the significant drivers of bird losses, but you will see that some greatly outweigh others. So direct mortality from cats is a huge driver. The next one are the window strikes. And you remember when Joni spoke during the keynote address about Lights Out Texas. That's one of our great partnerships to try to address that particular issue. Automobile strikes, power line collisions, and then the others just barely register, including wind turbine losses. So we have a pervasive threat. Climate change is a pervasive and persistent threat that includes sea level rise, urban land use change, croplands expansion as the thaw line, as the frost line extends north, more and more land can be farmed longer and longer. Those are the ideas around that. And then hot springs, fire weather, all the things that we're experiencing today, and including false spring, or a period of time early in spring where it warms up enough to tell plants to bud out, followed by the freeze that comes inevitably. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of jump through some of this portion. Renewable energy development is a key part of the intervention needed to address the climate change issue, particularly for birds. It's a chronic issue. We talked about acute problems, feral cats, window strikes, and things like that. This is a chronic issue. The intervention point has probably already passed, but we're also in it, and we have time to do things to make for a resilient climate future. Maybe not, we're not going to cancel it, but we can make for a more resilient climate future. Audubon in general supports wind energy transmission that is sited and operated properly to avoid, minimize, and mitigate effectively for the impacts on birds and other wildlife and the places they need to survive. And this map, I'll show it because it identifies some of the best areas to develop renewable energy resources for wind. And you can see that the Great Plains and the ridges of the mountains in the Southwest and the Rockies are some of the best sites to develop this renewable energy portfolio off of wind. So that's concerning because it's happening in the state at a significant pace. I'm going to jump past this and mention that one of the solutions that Audubon and partners are working on is to identify those parcels or those pieces of lands and landscapes that are most important to both siting, where can we reduce the conflicts the most, but also where can we invest in landscapes that are doing the good work of carbon sequestration and helping us abate many of the challenges associated with climate change. And I think that's probably going to cause me to be at my time. All right. I'll jump past this to say that one way that we're working to secure landscapes is, there's conservation easements that are tools to help slow down development on working lands and open space, but also we're looking at market-based approaches. One of the ones that Audubon has developed is to work within our membership and those conscientious consumers that can drive incentives by paying premiums, using the power of the dollar to incentivize landowners to adopt best management practices in the production of working lands products like beef, leather, and other goods. So by adopting these best management practices, they can create better, more productive forage for their animals, while also securing habitat for wildlife. And you and I get to play a part in that because I help write the best management practice for the landowner while also buying their products at the grocery store direct from market. I'll close it right there, and we can jump into the panel. It can be.
So, any questions? Let's open it up to any questions that y'all may have. Y'all can come up here if you want.
Audubon's working right now out on the pages. Yeah. Right. Or you could float on top of it. Yeah. Right now, one of the problems is not enough good water coming into Texas. Right. The irrigated someone needs to brine that's been freshened up with inflow. And so it's not water moving from Red Bluff Reservoir down to Imperial Reservoir, right? So there's no demand from Imperial Reservoir. There's still certification by our water storage, our drinking service, and irrigation, farming, water, not. Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the main analysis I'll do one of my also you're trying to get what
What other questions? Yes, Jason.
How does groundwater impact the estuaries and domestic use of some of these reservoirs? Does it help or does it hurt?
It's actually a good source if we could develop it more. For example, it's an alternative in many places. You do have to worry about issues of when you remove groundwater, the impact on springs and the spring connection. So all that is very real, and we're sitting in the middle of one where it's classically that way. But I'll tell you what's there that could be used, and that is brine groundwater. There's huge amounts of groundwater that has 1 or 2% brine. Seawater is like 30%. We have desalination plants that right now, and there's like 40 or 50 of them in Texas that make use of that water very, very economically. It's very competitive. So there are places where that type of thing is, we should be using that as much as we can. I didn't even know that. Well, see, that's excellent because that's a huge source of.
4 or 5 years ago.
It's on the bad water.
Please just stay the ink that they couldn't hear. Put on the mic that saws it.
Yeah, San Antonio water system has a desalination plant completed about 4 or 5 years ago. Uses water from the bad water line on the Balcones Fault, and yeah, it's and so we're actually getting that water is added into our drinking water system.
Yeah. No, that's excellent news. That's great.
The desalinated water goes back into the brine area.
Yeah, that's excellent news. I didn't even know that. So,
yeah.
Kudos.
Out of the room for a second, but the Tarpon Resurgence that you were telling me about.
That's right. Yeah, unfortunately, because of the time, I had to cut that out a little bit. You know, we one of the issues that that there was a time when tarpon were all up and down our coast in Corpus Christi Bay. We had a whole industry. When one of the President Roosevelt came down and caught tarpon and all that, and then they just disappeared. The reason they disappeared was because of reservoir construction, because tarpon need fresh water. They prefer brackish water, particularly to reproduce. And so when we cut all that water off, the tarpon just basically disappeared. But now that we started managing water and doing some of the work that we've talked about a little bit about, the tarpon have started to come back. And so what we're finding, unfortunately, we had a fish kill not too long ago. You may have heard about when the weather got really cold. And so that was really a disaster. But one of the things that we found small baby tarpon to 3 or 4 foot tarpon coming up all and down the coast around Corpus Christi. So they're coming back there. We didn't even know it. That's the first time we saw them. So they're hiding out from us. They figured out how we can't find them, but they are coming back in that regard. So if you can manage the water, you can put water into the bays at the right time, so that even though it's not as abundant or as much water as it was in the past, if it's done correctly, you can help minimize the impact of not having enough water. So we can do that. So thank you for that question.
Yes, sir.
I'm a volunteer, so I probably shouldn't be asking, but I have a good question, I think. Out in the West, they're removing a lot of dams in Washington State, California, things of that nature. Does the state of Texas have any kind of program, or is it even any kind of thought to that effect?
A few have been removed. Now they do it out there because of salmon, and the salmon are a species that they live in the oceans, but they have to come back up into the fresh water and up in the rivers to reproduce, and the dams have gotten in the way. So that has been a big issue there. The only thing we have close to that is striped bass and that type of thing. So there are some places though where dams were built, particularly on the Guadalupe, were built for hydropower that's no longer really active, and so the dams are being removed just as an obstruction to clear the rivers up. But it's not so much dams; it's the impact of the dam is the removal of the water and diverting of water to something else. That's the issue.
We'll be looking at another drought of Texas all the way to California, western states.
Well, I don't know if we call it drought or record, and Romey could probably talk about this too, because he's looked at climate change a lot. But I will tell you this, that what we're going to see in the next 50 years is in our part of the state where we may have 90-degree used to have 90-degree temperatures. I think it was 60 days a year. We'll start having 90-degree plus temperatures 110 days a year. So yes, we're going to have we haven't seen the drought record yet. If we're going to have those kinds of changes, that's just going to happen. There's nothing will stop that.
The number of 100-degree days is consistently gone up over the years.
Okay.
Is there are there people on the other side of the border who are sort of doing the same thing in terms of looking at the whole picture of the wildlife and what's happening there, what's happening there with there? Because I know that there's a tremendous loss of water coming into the Rio Grande.
Mm-hmm.
So the 1942 treaty that sort of dictates the volume of water and the allocation between Mexico and the U.S. on the Colorado also includes the Rio Grande. And I think one point to make is that when that treaty was written, they were going through a period of time where there was an abundance of water relative to the normal. So not only have we gone back down from a period of lush water in those basins to a normal, but now we're actually trending down, like less and less water. So you see like Lake Powell, Lake Mead, like they're not going to fill up again probably in our lives. Maybe. That's I'm uncertain. What I will say is, just to talk about water to complete that thought, is it's harder for the U.S. and it's harder for Mexico to meet their obligations to the other states with the water deliveries. So we saw a big compromise and negotiation between Mexico and U.S. On the Rio Grande deliveries from the Conchos, right? Where there was a big water transfer in Lake Falcon, and because they just couldn't meet, the farmers and ranchers were revolting down there because they had sure water in one reservoir, and that's the water that Mexico owed the U.S. They couldn't give it up. So this is creating not just wildlife conflict, landscape conflicts, but human conflicts. And it needs to be, there's probably some wisdom in resetting expectations based on what we got in the models for climate-driven change.
For the time in Mexico and Cuba and so forth, and they're having the exact same problems with their rivers being diverted for other purposes that's going in. The issue is that their conservation efforts, they have some groups like Nature Conservancy and Audubon there, but they're just not as effective as they are here to at least bring those issues forward and try to deal with them. So they've got some real problems that they're dealing with. It's very serious there.
Getting back to the thought about birds, those three birds that I pointed out, those were just there. This is just talking about how Texas is a unique place of convergence. But we are seeing through the lens of birds. Birds are telling us that there is a change in climate because we're seeing species that were never associated with the hill country, for instance. They were associated with South Texas or even Mexican to originate, showing up here now in abundance. And just in the last 30 years, green kingfishers, kiskadees, and others that can be sort of a harbinger of what's happening.
Other harbinger they have in Europe is grapes. Because the temperature is getting warmer, and so the better grapes now are moving into northern France.
I just had a quick question about the comment I heard at the luncheon, I believe, about that Texas has a third of the global migrating birds going through it. Is that correct?
I don't know specifically, but it's a mind-boggling amount.
Yeah.
Like the number, like I think 97% of species in North America show up and migrate through Texas at least at some point in their life cycles. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the volume is in particular of all animals, but
yeah.
it's a funnel.
I thought I heard that quote anyway.
I think we have to conclude the talk here today, but possibly as we're changing out